Stripe API versions are designed to keep your integration safe from breaking changes. We're constantly improving the Stripe API with both backwards compatible and breaking changes. Most of the improvements we make are backwards compatible, meaning they're safe for existing Stripe integrations. These changes include things like adding new API resources, new optional request parameters, new object properties, and more. Backwards compatible changes are available immediately to everyone, regardless of their API version. Sometimes, though, improving the API requires us to make breaking changes, such as changing default behavior, changing the type or name of existing properties and parameters, removing things from the API, and so on. Every time we make one or more breaking changes to the API, we release a new API version, and existing integrations have to opt in to the new version. Stripe API versions take the form of the day breaking changes are released, in year, month, day format. One thing to note before we continue is that backwards compatible changes do not result in a new API version. For example, checkout sessions were added to the API in December of 2018, but no new API version was released at that time because no breaking changes were made. Adding checkout sessions to the API had no effect on existing integrations, and checkout sessions were immediately available to everyone on any API version, even API versions which predate the existence of Stripe Checkout. API versions are used to protect existing integrations from breaking changes. They are not used to restrict access to new features, unless those new features take the form of breaking changes. To explain how API versions protect your integration, let's look at an example Stripe account and a timeline. We'll start in January of 2021, when our example account is created. Stripe accounts have a default API version, which is set to the most recent API version when the account makes its first API request, which is usually the same day the account is created. In January of 2021, the most recent API version was 2020-08-27. So that's what this account's default API version is set to. Note that an account's default API version will not change unless it's explicitly upgraded, which can be done in the Stripe dashboard. Next, in March of 2021, some code is written and deployed to this account's Stripe integration. Let's have a look at one specific part of that code, a getCheckoutShipping function. This function takes a checkout session as an argument and returns the checkout session's shipping property. This code was written while this Stripe account's default API version was set to 2020-08-27, which means it received objects rendered using that default API version. This works great because that's what this code is designed to handle. Now let's jump forward to August of 2022, when a new API version is released. Sorry about the timeline not being to scale. In API version 2022-08-01, several breaking changes were made, one of which was to rename the shipping property on checkout sessions to shipping_details. That means this getCheckoutShipping function will not work with API version 2022-08-01 because checkout sessions in that API version no longer have a shipping property. That's okay though. The API versions did their job and protected this integration from this breaking change. The default API version set on this account will not change without explicit action, so this account's default API version stays on 2020-08-27 and everything continues to work. However, there is one more thing to add to the timeline. In September of 2022, the default API version on this account is upgraded. After the upgrade, this account's default API version is 2022-08-01. That means all objects will be rendered with this new API version by default. So checkout sessions will now have a shipping_details property instead of a shipping property. That change is not compatible with this getCheckoutShipping function and will cause the code to throw an error when it attempts to access a shipping property which does not exist. When you attempt to upgrade your API version in the dashboard, we provide ample warnings to make sure your integration can handle the change before proceeding. Nevertheless, sometimes well-intentioned people see an upgrade as available, disregard the warnings, and proceed without understanding the scope of the change they're making. This kind of thing can and does happen, but the good news is you can safeguard your integration against scenarios like this one by following a few best practices. The first best practice is to set an explicit API version in your code. You can specify the API version your code is designed to work with in the Stripe version header of your API requests. This tells Stripe to render objects in the response using the specified API version instead of the default API version set on your account. If you use our official libraries for dynamic languages like Stripe.js on the front end or PHP, Node.js, Ruby, or Python on the back end, you can specify an API version to be used for all requests when you initialize the library. Our backend libraries also give you the option of specifying an API version for individual requests as well. Our official libraries for strongly typed languages like Java, .NET, and Go are already pinned to a specific API version due to the strict type requirements in those languages. You can check each library's changelog to find out which library version is pinned to which API version. One thing to note is that Stripe library and SDK versions are separate and independent from Stripe API versions. For example, at the time this video was recorded, the newest version of the Stripe PHP library was 9.6.0, which is not related to the current API version, which is 2022-08-01. The second best practice is to set an explicit API version on your webhook endpoints. When creating webhook endpoints, you should do so using the API and set the API_version property to the API version your integration is expecting. Doing so will tell Stripe to render events in that API version when delivering them to that webhook endpoint. In fact, if you have multiple webhook endpoints with different API versions listening for the same event, Stripe will render multiple copies of that event in the different API versions specified. Those copies will then be delivered to the corresponding webhook endpoints, so they all receive the events in the API versions they're expecting. These first two best practices allow you to define the API version used to render objects and API responses, and the API version used to render events delivered to your webhook endpoints. That means your code will continue to work even if the default API version on your account is unexpectedly changed. If you don't specify an API version when making requests, or if you don't set an API version when creating webhook endpoints, Stripe will render objects using your default API version. That means your integration will only work if your default API version never changes, which is a dangerous assumption to make. Also, if you're building an integration which is designed to be used with other Stripe accounts, where the default API version is unknown, it's even more important to specify the API version your integration is designed to work with. There is one other best practice, which is to take note of automated Stripe operations which use your default API version. You usually don't have to worry about this if you follow the first two best practices, as the objects you obtain from Stripe will be rendered using the API version you specify regardless of the API version used to create or modify those objects. However, sometimes new API versions introduce different default behavior, which can affect what happens when Stripe performs automated actions which are not associated with a specific API request or webhook endpoint. Examples of automated actions are things like Stripe creating an invoice for a new subscription period, or creating a subscription based on a subscription schedule. Operations like these use your Stripe account's default API version because they are not tied to an API request or webhook endpoint which has a specific API version set. As a result, the behavior of these operations may be unexpected if your default API version is different from the API version specified in your integration. If your integration relies on automated Stripe operations, it's a good idea to keep your default API version set to the same API version used in your integration. One last thing. You should always use the newest API version possible. The reason we make breaking changes is to improve the API, which means newer API versions have advantages like better default behavior and increased performance. Upgrading your API will let you take advantage of those improvements, so upgrading is generally recommended. However, you should always use caution when upgrading your API version. As you've seen here, upgrading your default API version can cause some undesirable outcomes, so make sure your integration is ready before you proceed. As long as you read the list of breaking changes carefully and test thoroughly before upgrading, which you can do by specifying the new API version explicitly in your test environment, you should be able to upgrade your API version without any issues. Most importantly, follow best practices and don't rely on your account's default API version. Specify the API version your integration is designed to work with in your code and when creating webhook endpoints. Doing so will safeguard your integration from breaking changes and help you avoid unfortunate surprises.